All right, we're live. Okay, thanks for coming, everybody. I'm Jeff Miller, head of instruction here at Target Test Prep, and we are here doing another interview with a successful TTP student. This is a super cool interview because I have Barry here who scored a 765, which is in the 100th percentile on the GMAT Focus. So Barry absolutely crushed it. So welcome, Barry. Thank you for joining me today.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you so much. Wonderful to be here. Excited to chat with you all.
Yeah, no, me too. So for anyone who's here live, feel free to throw questions into the chat box. We can get through them, whether myself or Barry, throughout the interview here, and hopefully get you guys in a place where you feel better about the GMAT Focus after this than you did when you came. So to jump in, Barry, everyone's probably wondering, first and foremost, kind of your background and all of that good stuff before we get into kind of GMAT-specific things.
Yeah, absolutely. So I'm from the Midwest. I grew up in Ohio, and then I stayed in the Midwest for college, where I went to Notre Dame. I was a science business major there and really loved all of the business courses that I took. From there, I was also a pre-med major in college. And so from there, I went to medical school at Johns Hopkins in Baltimore, Maryland, where I stuck around, and I'm finishing up my residency training now.
Got it. All right. So I'm sure some of that is definitely relevant for what you've been doing, especially in the GMAT Quant side. And let's talk a little bit about your GMAT journey. I know you eventually found your way to Target Test Prep, as most people do. Why don't you start off by just talking about how that whole journey started, what the catalyst was for getting started, and then what you kind of did initially for your preparation.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you, Jeff. So starting out thinking about the GMAT and business school, I knew I wanted to go to business school, but I didn't know almost anything about the GMAT. So a lot of my preliminary thoughts centered around how does the GMAT test you? What does the GMAT look like? And given the time that I started looking at that, it was just when the GMAT Focus was starting to, be part of the transition from the old GMAT to the new GMAT. And so I didn't know what it was at first, but then when I learned more about the format of it, I got pretty excited that it was fewer questions, shorter time, you could change answers if you needed to. And then similarly, in terms of preparation, wanting to do as well as I could on it, I started looking online for what are the best resources. And I came across a few. I started out with some of the more official prep resources from the GMAT company itself. Started with a lot of those practice questions, some of their free resources, some of their practice problem sets. And then I was moving through those pretty quickly, but I wasn't sure that I had a full comprehensive systematic approach to learning the material and to making sure that I had all of the concepts down. And it seemed like from what I was reading online and in different forums, it seemed like Target Test Prep was going to be able to offer that. And so I took a look at it with the free trial and then put it on the back burner for a little bit while I finished up some more of those official practice resources. And then came back to it, bought a 1-month subscription, really dived in as quickly and thoroughly as I could, realized that wasn't going to be quite enough time to get it done, and then kind of bought an additional subscription from there to make sure that I had it all the way up through the time that I actually took the GMAT Focus. And
got it. Yeah, that's a pretty standard path, I'd say. One of the things that I think a lot of people do when they're starting out is they think, okay, well, let me just get the official guide. The official guide is a fine book. I'm sure you noticed it. It had its benefits, but yeah, it's just, even the online question bank, it's the same thing. It's not built for learning, right? It's built for a lot of practice. It's something that a lot of students use after completing TTP, where they're going through and learning the content. So it sounds like that's kind of the position you found yourself in when you kind of grab the official guide. You realize, okay, well, this is a decent start, but I probably need more and more of a foundation.
Yeah, exactly. That's exactly how I felt. I think that, like you said, there were some fairly general tips in there. There was some study material, but a lot of questions that I definitely want to make sure that I got through. And I did get through all of those. I got through most of their resources as well.
Right.
I felt like, Target Test Prep had obviously a lot of additional content resources that were really helpful for laying a strong foundation. And then I felt like the hard practice questions within Target Test Prep really reinforced things in a very meaningful way too. So I felt like the questions part of Target Test Prep, in addition to the questions from the official guide, was really pivotal.
Yeah, and you know what else is interesting? So, and obviously there was going to be this crop of people, right? So you came into the GMAT just knowing about focus. Like the classic GMAT didn't necessarily mean anything to you, right?
Right. I had done some flashcards. I had done some flashcards back in the day, just as I'd been thinking about business school and thinking about starting to prepare. And so I knew that geometry was a big part of it. And so when I was learning about the focus and the geometry, I was pretty pleased. But yeah.
Right. So that's interesting because a lot of people are always comparing, okay, well, this is what the classic is, this is what the focus is, but you came in and focus was just the test. Right. So you didn't really, yes, you knew about some of the things with the old exam, but it wasn't a scenario where you had to kind of shift gears or anything like that. So it's kind of cool to see, and this was the whole thing with the new GMAT Focus, that they wanted students to like this test. So it's nice to see that it worked out well for you as far as the content and the prep and stuff like that. All right, so you did the official guide, you found TTP, you're here. Tell me about your path through Target Test Prep. You said you started with a month, you needed more time. I'm definitely curious as to how that kind of went for you.
Yeah, so I definitely took the mission-based approach as opposed to, I think there was also a schedule-based approach, but started from the beginning, tried to complete the missions in order as best I could. I think that really dived in. I think that I tried to move through the lessons at a pretty swift pace, just because I felt like I didn't have a ton of time overall. I made sure to do every example that was part of the lessons and found those to be very, very helpful for me. I think that those did a nice job of exploring different difficulty levels and also different nuances that were, kind of the point of the lesson. And so I felt like that was an efficient way to do it for me. And then I really, really emphasized the practice tests at the end of each mission, or the end of each set of lessons as well.
Right.
Those were incredibly beneficial. I felt like I usually started with the easy tests and then progressed to the medium tests and then to the hard tests. And I felt like by the time that I'd mastered the hard tests, I felt like I had a pretty good grasp of the material that was in each of those each of those concept sets. I think that laying some of the foundations early on with like properties of numbers, like general GMAT, math principles, those sorts of things was helpful. And then I did have to come back to those kind of later on. So I would typically go through and try to meet all the benchmarks for the tests at the end of the missions. But then towards the end of my study time, I would come back and try to get 100% on all of those. One, review, and then two, make sure I wasn't missing any little pieces of content. So that's kind of how I worked my way through, and then finished up with the practice tests.
Did you find that you were doing every single chapter test related to each mission, or were you doing like enough of the easies to feel like you had mastery, and then moving to the mediums, then moving to the hards? Like, what was your progression of the chapter tests?
Yeah, so for the chapter tests, I pretty consistently completed all of the easy ones, and then all of the medium ones, and then all of the hard ones. Again, trying to hit at least those benchmark scores set by TTP, if not redoing some of the more challenging ones. But I went pretty much.
Okay, cool. And as far as the chapter readings were concerned, when you dove into those, were you taking notes and obviously doing the example questions and watching the video solutions and stuff like that?
Yeah, so it was a blend. I felt like there were some pressures on my time. I I work full time, and so this was kind of a lot of studying in the evenings, a lot of studying on weekends, a lot of studying kind of here and there. But in trying to be efficient, I feel like I didn't really take too many notes. I would use the bookmark feature from time to time. Usually if there was a lesson that I thought this is really salient and I want to come back to it, I would bookmark it. But then I did really emphasize the examples while going through those. And then what was the other part? I thought there was one more piece that I wanted to comment on. So examples.
Maybe the videos.
Yeah, the video. So I used the videos mainly when there was something that I didn't understand and was having trouble understanding from the written solution. Usually I found the written solution to be an efficient way to kind of get on track. But then when I couldn't figure it out, I used the videos.
Yeah, that's what I tell students, because a lot of times students will ask like, hey, like, should I watch the video and, read the text? But there's efficacy to both. It's just a lot of it does have to do with your timeline, how well you understand something, so on and so forth. So for sure, I agree with you that's a good move. And then as far as, there's a lot of material and you got through most of it, right? And so, we get this question a lot, like, how do I recall things from older topics? Now, the interesting part of that conversation is, first and foremost, in the study plan itself, we have a lot of review quizzes, like at the beginning of missions. We have like quarterly, you could call them, review tests where we have students doing the last, 4 chapters or so. So I imagine those helped you with your recall of older topics, but was there other things you were doing in addition to that?
Yeah, those definitely helped with the recall, and I appreciated how those were interspersed throughout. I think that in addition to doing those faithfully, I think that I used the TTP equation sheet a decent amount. I would go back and review some of those concepts. I think that it hit a lot of the most important concepts in equations, especially related to things like properties of numbers, combinations and permutations, probability, those sorts of things. I kind of had this instinctual feeling throughout of like, these are kind of the holes in my preparation right now, like nuances related to probability and how you add them, or like if you start with 1 and then subtract a variety of different probabilities from it, like what are the specific scenarios with that? And so I kind of knew that those were things that I was going to want to go back and review as well. So I made a point to do that. So kind of keeping a list of topics that I wanted to brush up on. And then finally, I think that it was really helpful for me towards the end of my preparation, once I'd gotten through all of the lessons and chapters and all of the tests associated with those, I made a pretty strong effort to go back and redo a lot of those practice tests, really shooting for getting all of the questions correct, which was kind of like my own built-in review for some of those earlier concepts.
Yep. And what about the our flashcards? Were you using some of those to help recall? Because those are kind of like mini quizzes in themselves. I don't know if a lot of people will make their own from our equation guide, but then we kind of took the equation guide and morphed it into flashcards and kind of amped that up a level. Were you using the flashcards that we had, or was it kind of more some of your own kind of organic stuff based off of our equation guide and things you were reading and stuff like that?
Yeah, I used those a little bit. I spent probably the most time in terms of that particular area with the actual PDF of the equation guide, looking through it, trying to even block out some of the stuff that I felt really familiar with, so I could really focus on some of the more nuanced concepts. But I do think that I could have spent more time with the TTP flashcards. But most of my review in that sense was with the PDF of the equation guide, then actually going back into the lessons themselves that I had like flagged in my mind as needing help. Like remainders always kind of threw me a little bit, and so I probably went back to those lessons 2 or 3 times to just redo the lessons in their entirety.
Right. The equation guide is nice too because you can print it out, so you can kind of bring it along with you. And I was talking to a student today who's taking the test on Saturday, and one of the things I said is get those equations down, because I'm sure you noticed this on the GMAT where you found success, especially in the quant section.
Yeah.
There's a lot of stuff you have to recall.
Absolutely.
And if you can't recall it, right, like you'll find yourself kind of at an inflection point where you may just not be able to deal with a question.
Yeah.
It's not all questions, but it's enough. Like something they added to the GMAT Focus, which you didn't need to use before, for example, was the quadratic formula.
Yeah.
And I don't see there was, from what I know about the previous GMAT, I never saw an instance where, you had to use that formula, but you do in questions for the Focus. They have one on their MBA.com practice exam.
Yeah.
But that's an example, like, the formula, you get it right. You don't know the formula, you struggle, you take a guess. So I'm assuming you noticed some of that, especially when taking the GMAT and doing your practice exams.
Yeah, 100%. Definitely. I actually think that, again, knowing that I want to go to business school, but not really knowing too much about the GMAT, I was actually pretty surprised by the number of things that were like that. And like you said, kind of new to the GMAT and only seeing it through the lens of the Focus. But nevertheless, there was a surprising amount of those things that you just mentioned on the test, which I think is what drew me towards TTP to begin with, was this desire for this more systematic, thorough, comprehensive quant review to make sure that I wasn't missing, the quadratic formula, but any number of, little equations like that, like you said, would make the difference between getting a question right or wrong. So that drew me in to begin with. I noticed that question that you mentioned on the MBA.com practice test.
Right.
And I think that really across all of the different chapters, there were at least a couple of those sorts of things where had you done the lesson and remembered it, it could pretty easily make the difference between getting a question right or wrong, especially with the computer adaptive test where you're kind of getting hit with a lot of hard questions too. And it seems like, among those, knowing that equation quickly and being familiar with it would make a pretty big difference there.
Oh, wow. So that's super interesting. So you basically, you'd be presented with questions on the test, and you were like, oh, wow, like here's this formula. I never thought I'd have to use it. And then you do. I mean, that was kind of the process.
Kind of, yeah. I mean, I think having gone through the whole TTP course, I was very, very familiar with needing to use a lot of those equations. So I wasn't too surprised when I had to use them. But I mean, throughout all of the quant, some of the data insights sections, certainly a lot of if you can quickly recall the formula, you're going to be definitely a step ahead, both from getting the question correct and also from a timing perspective.
Right. Well, it must have been a good feeling though, because I always say, if you can build confidence as you go through the test and you realize the stuff, I mean, I guess, from just when I had taken the GMAT or stuff like that, like I always feel like there's no better feeling than when you have learned something and then you see it almost verbatim on the test. That must be huge for your confidence.
Yeah, absolutely. Definitely a big momentum test as well. I know TTP strategy session or lessons talks a good amount about kind of trying to string together correct answers and trying to not string together incorrect answers. And so like you're saying, when you can build that confidence early in a section and kind of keep it going from there, yeah, it definitely makes a huge difference in terms of getting questions correct, but also having that momentum throughout the section.
Yeah, and that's something we say in the strategy chapter 2, which is a big proponent of mine. Like, no matter how minuscule you think a potential formula is, it's probably it's necessary. And we can do this thing where we say to ourselves, why would I ever need to know that? Something like, how to know a decimal terminates, right? Prime it out and you get 2s and 5s. And it just seems like, no, there's no way they're going to test me on that. Or the number of factors, right? That rule where you prime. Yeah. But those things can show up. And the cool thing about those types of formulas are that if you, as you said, if you know the formula, you just you get it right. So that's a really cool thing to hear that happened with you.
I mean, Jeff, what you're saying too, it also makes it a much less frustrating test. I remember in some of my early preparation before TTP, I'd be staring at questions like that and thinking, like, trying to derive my own rules, trying to find patterns myself, trying to logic my way through it, just staring at it for a while, whatever it was. It's very frustrating. But then if you've got those kind of rules in your head about what is a terminating decimal, it goes so much quicker and it's so much less frustrating. Or everything from 3s to 6s to 9s to all of those different number properties makes a huge difference there too. In terms of timing, accuracy, but then even just your overall experience practicing for and taking the test. It's a much smoother process that way.
Yeah, and you go in with a level of confidence that you're like, okay, if and when I see these certain things, I'll be able to knock them out of the park. So, yeah, that's awesome, man. That's really cool to hear. I mean, we've heard it before, but it's nice to hear it again because I'm a huge proponent in that as far as how you can find success on the GMAT, or at least one of the things that can help you find success on the GMAT. Now, we do have a question. Did you take all the official mocks before taking the real test? What are the test taking strategies one should adopt before taking the test? So any insights on test taking strategies, and then, of course, how many practice tests you took leading into the real thing?
Yeah, absolutely. I think the easier of those questions is how many. I took all of them. So I took all of them as TTP recommended. I probably would have done that anyway. I took them, at least my impression of TTP's recommendations were to take them all kind of towards the end of your preparation. Like you'd already moved through a lot of the missions, and these were some of the last missions involved. And so I think that I took all 6 of them within about 2.5 weeks of taking the actual exam. And again, I've been preparing for about probably a solid 3 months total. So this was towards the end for sure. In terms of test taking strategy, I think that one thing that I found beneficial was kind of knowing yourself and knowing the order in which you wanted to take the sections. I felt like in terms of, I took Quant first, and I felt like I wanted to do that because, like we were saying earlier, with the confidence, kind of going in feeling like you've got a very solid knowledge base coming out of TTP's prep work, I felt like that was something where I could apply those equations. I'd done a ton of quant practice, and I felt like that would be a good way to start out of the gate. I felt like I took the reading section next that had gone pretty well on all of the practice exams too, and so I felt like that was a nice middle one to have. And then I wanted to take data insights last because I was going to put my break before that, so I could kind of refuel a little bit, reset, and then come in with some good energy for that final push. So I guess knowing yourself and knowing the order of the sections is important. I think that just doing those practice tests and really taking them seriously is really helpful. I liked and implemented TTP's advice to do warm-up questions beforehand, so that you kind of come into the first question with your brain awake and ready to do some math or whatever you want to do first. And so I think that those were the big things. I think that there was a little bit of trickiness with timing strategy. I definitely read those strategy lessons, and it kind of talked about how to read the clock in an effective way, which was helpful. I think that there's a little bit of tension on the GMAT focus between do I try to quickly move on from a question that I don't know too well, or do I try to stick with it to try to get it right? I think that was kind of one of the nuances that I grappled with a little bit, is how much time to give myself before moving on from a question. But I typically found that taking a little bit less time and not getting behind on the clock was a fairly effective strategy.
Yeah, it's a fine balance, because if you get to a place where you're too quick to give up on a question, you don't realize it, but then subconsciously you're just getting rid of questions. And then by the time you're at the end of the section, you're like, oh boy, like I think I guessed them way too many. So part of it is understanding your strengths and weaknesses, which you clearly did, right? Knowing, okay, I'm not great at functions, and here's this tricky function question, like what should I potentially do with it? And then, part of it is developing your kind of internal clock strategy. And again, this is all stuff you can do in the MBA.com practice exams. And another thing that you mentioned that I think is a very useful piece of advice is you said understanding the section order. Now, for everyone listening to this, Barry said, hey, I like Quant. Quant was my strong suit. I'm going to do it first. But everybody's different because the dilemma is, do I do the stuff I feel good at first when I'm freshest and then developing a level of confidence that kind of carries me through the test? Or do I want to take the thing I'm weakest in first because I'm freshest and I can muster enough energy for the stronger topics on the back end of the test? It's a weird dilemma, and I never have a perfect answer. I think your answer was as close to perfect as you can, which is just figure it out. Did you practice with different test orders, or did you find that Quant first was the move and then you just stuck with that?
So I thought about practicing with different orders. I almost switched it up a couple times, and then I just decided not to. I think one little nuance there is I definitely felt like Quant was one where I put in a lot of good work, a lot of practice, felt it was a strong suit. But I also felt part of my rationale was that it was one of the more formulaic ones. Like, didn't know what data stuff I was going to come across. Felt like, with the data section, there's a lot of like really, really fine detail, and I was not sure if that was like the best one to open with. Didn't know what reading passages I would come across, but felt like with Quant being one of the more formulaic ones, that was part of my rationale was, you've practiced, your equations. Could be one of the more straightforward ones. But I didn't end up practicing with different section orders, but I thought about it. If I were going to do a different section order, I definitely would have practiced with it first.
Yeah, and if you find if the shoe fits, right, there's no point in trying to tinker with that, unless you're finding that sometimes you're doing better than others depending on the particular section order. So yeah, that's really good advice because people ask that a lot, and sometimes it doesn't matter for students, and then sometimes it does. So yeah, you just got to really it's a really, really personal decision. So you have to put in the time and effort and thought into what you think would work best for you, because we all react differently to a different kind of set of circumstances or positioning on this test. Okay, some more questions. Do you think that data insights is more difficult in comparison with Quant?
So I think that, like you mentioned very early on in the interview here, like given my background, which was fairly scientific, pre-med, going through med school, being in residency now, I'm very used to looking at a lot of different charts, a lot of different figures, making those sorts of comparisons, kind of reading those multi-source reasoning passages and things like them closely. And so I didn't feel like it was totally out of left field for me. But I felt like that was more of a personal background sort of thing. I think that there's potential for it to be more challenging. I think that the way I kind of looked at it was, to me, it seemed like you were probably going to get more nuanced, difficult concepts or tricky questions within the quant section. But data insights could become tricky based on those kind of the number of questions that you have to answer, like the ones with 3 different parts, the ones with like 2-part analysis, data sufficiency. It felt to me like a much more time-intensive question without a whole lot of room for extra thinking. And so I think depending on kind of what your skills are or what what suits how you take tests, either one could be more difficult. But for me, I did feel like data insights was mostly like an energy and effort sort of thing, and then like really fine attention to detail.
Right. Now, did you also find, data sufficiency, I'm sure you'd say yes, you noticed a lot of quant topics there.
Yeah.
Would you say you noticed specific things being tested, especially in like 2-part analysis, table analysis, with say like statistics and percentages and ratios and stuff like that?
Yeah. So in terms of that, I think that, like you said, definitely a ton of all of the different quant topics within the data sufficiency. I'm not sure that I saw perfect correlations with any particular topics being tested in like the two-part analysis or things like that. It wouldn't all have been stats or ratios or percentages. I felt like sometimes there was more guess and check strategy involved than there was in quant. I felt like usually quant, I was, reading the question, then trying to find a solution, and then, choosing that answer so as to not get led astray by the incorrect answers in quant. But I felt like for data insights, with some of those two-part analysis questions, it required a little bit more. These are the options, which ones could be reasonable, and then kind of testing those.
Right. But some of the, I would say, or I would ask, some of the quant skills that you picked up and learned you would carry over to the DI, like
absolutely necessary. Yeah. I don't think it would be possible to do well on data insights without having picked up a lot of those TTP quant skills.
Right. And that's actually why we teach it at the end of the course, because we want students to have those like skill sets in place. Yeah. And another question is, did you get time to review at the end? Like, did you save things and did you have time to review them, or did you just kind of go straight through to the end of the sections?
Like while taking the test, correct?
Yeah, exactly. Like, did you take advantage of the reviewing, right? That GMAT offers at the end of like the new thing that they added for Focus, basically. So for context, that wasn't a thing with the classic GMAT, but it is with the Focus.
Right. So I did. I felt like I had more timing challenges on the mocks or the practice exams leading up to the real thing. I felt like on the actual test, I'm not sure if it was adrenaline or whatever else it could have been, but I felt like I was able to kind of stay focused, get through the questions in a fairly efficient manner, not get too bogged down on like any particular questions. And then I did feel like towards the end of those sections, I was able to go through and review. I'm not sure how important or how helpful it was. I think that looking at, I don't think I changed much. I don't think that any brilliant insights came to me towards the end there. But thankfully I did feel like I was able to review a little bit. I think one thing that worries me about that is there's maybe a tendency to feel like because you can go back and review, maybe doing the questions right the first time doesn't matter as much because you can go back and review, change 3 answers, whatever it is.
Right.
Whereas that worried me from like the computer adaptive test format style, where I felt like I couldn't just discard questions very easily the first time around because I was worried that if I did that, then I'd not get the kinds of questions that would get me more points, which I know TTP kind of guided me on how that works, where when you get questions correct, you get harder questions, and those harder questions are worth more points. And so that made me reluctant to give up on questions too quickly as well.
Right. Yeah, people have a lot of questions about the algorithm that unfortunately no one truly knows the answer to. Of if I go back and I change a question, how does that affect? Because when it's question adaptive, but you can also skip and review and do things like that and change things, how it adjusts the score. But GMAT is not necessarily providing that information. But yeah, it's a tough thing because it's only 3 questions, so you have to kind of make decisions, and then you ask yourself, hey, was my initial instinct correct? And then do you have the proper time to go in and re-review stuff? So yeah, there's a lot of interesting components to that part of it, but it sounds like you didn't really overthink it. And, if you do know your stuff, then that review is okay. It's not, I wouldn't call it necessary, but I suppose it could be a safety net if there's a question that you should be getting right, and for whatever reason, it's just not sticking, then you can say, all right, I'm going to guess, mark for review, and then come back to this particular question.
Yeah, absolutely. I think that is how I used it, and I think that was fair. I think I appreciated having it there compared to what would have been more of the classic GMAT, where you just didn't even have the option to go back and look at anything.
Yeah, unfortunately, it's just like another thing in your brain that's kind of in the back of your head as you're going through all of these questions. But, if you don't let it kind of overwhelm you throughout the test, then you can kind of use it advantageously, which again sounds like what you did, which is great. Another question is taking the test next Tuesday. So we're talking about 5 days. What did you do in your last few days? And I have some thoughts too, but I'd love to hear from you first about, things you were doing.
Yeah, absolutely. So I definitely felt like there was a lot of practice questions leading up to the final push. And I felt like I had gotten to the point where I could notice that my freshness was making a difference in terms of how I was understanding things, how I was approaching questions. On some of my mock practice tests, I was able to notice that if I had stayed up working late the night before on practice questions, they typically wouldn't go quite as well as if I'd gotten more hours of sleep. And so not wanting to leave any of that potential brain power on the table, I actually took 2 full days off before the test. So I took it on a Wednesday, took all of Tuesday off, took all of Monday off. And then so that Sunday night, I kind of pushed it kind of late studying, like after midnight. But I had taken more or less 2 full days off before taking the actual test. Prior to that, I had taken some of those practice tests leading up to it. And then like I've kind of alluded to earlier in this interview, I made an effort to go back and redo some of the harder tests for some of those concepts that I didn't quite feel as confident in. So I wanted to refresh probability. I wanted to refresh combinations and permutations with some of those like hard chapter practice tests to make sure all of the nuances were, as fresh in my brain as they could be.
Yep. That makes sense. So that's interesting. And again, I personally think this is another kind of personal decision that students have to make. Like, do I want to keep my week as standard and normal as possible, or do I feel better about focusing on the GMAT in the next few days? And like, the fact is that for different people, you want to do different things, like for you, so I guess it's safe to say like it didn't overwhelm you to say, hey, like I'm going to be focused on the GMAT for these 2 days. You felt like you actually needed it going into the test. Is that a safe assumption?
What do you mean by that? So going to be focused on the GMAT for these 2 days? You said not.
Well, like, okay, right. So let me tell you what I did back when I took the last time I took the GMAT. So the day before, I actually just watched a movie. I went to the movies by myself, and I'd never done that. That wasn't like a natural thing for me to do, but I was like, okay, I want to, and I worked that day. So I think I took a half day of work, and then the GMAT was the next day. So for you focused on the GMAT in the days leading up to the test, right? Yeah. And, people always ask this because sometimes when you're home and you're just focused on the test, your brain can do crazy things. Like, am I going to do good? Am I not going to do good? And so for you, though, you felt like that was what you needed to feel your best on test day. Is that correct?
Yeah, I think so. I did kind of get out and about and do some activities on Monday. I did some normal stuff on Tuesday. It was mostly, I felt like I was actually trying to focus less on the GMAT in some ways. So I think my typical week would have been kind of working during the day, but then also like pretty strong study pushes at night. And so in some way, I felt like I was taking my mind off of it a little bit. I feel like some people could find that overwhelming to kind of break up that routine. And I found it a little bit risky. I felt like giving up that practice time could be a bit of a risk, but I felt like that the potential benefit of like being fresher was going to be helpful for me.
Well, that's good. Yeah. So you kind of did the same thing I did, where you took the time off, but you didn't cram for your test, and you didn't worry about your test. Well, that's good. And like I said, everybody is different. So you have to look at your own situation. You have to look at what your stressors are, how to avoid stressors. I mean, there's just so much to it that you have to be aware of. And then this is kind of a general question. What tips or advice would you like to give to students who are current GMAT aspirants? And honestly, like this is probably the conclusion to everything that you've been talking about today. But do you have any words of wisdom that you'd like to share with people who are currently in the thick of it studying for their GMAT?
Yeah, I think that I found it really helpful to try to be pretty comprehensive. I felt like, as we talked about earlier, it was really big for my confidence to be able to systematically work through all of the different concepts that could be tested on the GMAT. I felt like that helped me both with accuracy, helped me with timing, and then also helped confidence-wise. I felt pretty confident that having done the TTP course, things would go well. I feel like there's obviously plenty of test day variables, but I felt like having gone through it systematically, there was going to be a good outcome. And it was just unclear exactly what that outcome would be, but I felt like it was very good preparation. I think that knowing that it's a time-limited endeavor where you might study really hard for 2 or 3 months, but then be able to see the light at the end of the tunnel, I think was refreshing for me as well. Like, this was not going to be a perpetual study period. It was just a very focused, certain set period of time. And then I would just, again, try to advise to not overlook those strategy lessons too, just because I felt like they really delved into a lot of good test taking things. And even beyond all of the section specific concepts, I feel like test day is oftentimes kind of getting the most out of what you know. And I really appreciate how TTP, more than anyone else, addressed a lot of those things and really put an emphasis on performing to your potential.
Yeah, I mean, I like how you went into it with a very specific mindset of, okay, this is going to be a finite process as far as my studying. It's not going to go on forever, but also understanding like the level of effort that has to be put in to succeed, right? Because this is not an easy test. It's a test that has a lot of information, a lot you need to learn, but it just seems like you kind of took that mindset going in. I do think students who struggle are ones who maybe have a warped sense of reality about like what it's going to take to succeed on the GMAT. So if after 4 to 6 weeks, they're not seeing the improvement they need, or not kind of seeing the light at the end of the tunnel, then they're like, well, maybe I'm not going to be able to succeed on this, but you can. You just have to understand that it's a process and a journey. And of course, that everybody's journey is unique. So even people watching this need to understand that, Barry's journey is going to be different from yours, but there's nothing that he did that you can't, as long as you kind of follow the right process and put in the time and all that stuff.
Yeah, absolutely. And I liked what you said there too. Like, don't be discouraged if after 4 to 6 weeks, it's not exactly where you want it to be, because like I was saying, I was surprised by how many really important concepts there were, how many things I needed to refresh. And it did take me at least a full month longer than I anticipated it taking to study. So I would make sure to give yourself enough time and not be discouraged if it is taking longer than expected.
Yeah, I agree. Because the thing is, when you get the score that you need, regardless of how long it took, like, that's success, right? So, you found it. Tons of TTP students have found it. Everyone here can find it, but yeah, you just have to understand that it's your own unique situation, and take advice. Like Barry gave awesome advice today. Take advice of others, talk to people, but then kind of internalize it in your own specific way, so that you're not thinking like you have to mimic exactly what other people are doing. Take the bits and pieces that work for you, and that's going to make you successful. So this was great, Barry. I appreciate you spending some time here with me, and the people watching and the people who will be watching the recording. You absolutely dominated the GMAT. 765 is so cool. 100th percentile, so cool. So I hope you're super proud of what you've done, and I'm sure you're super pumped that it's over, and that this is probably your swan song. I won't have you do any more interviews from here on out. And thank you everybody for coming, asking great questions. So yeah, I think we're good here. So thanks again, Barry. Thanks everybody. And if anyone needs anything, you can always reach out to us. We're happy to help.
Absolutely. Thank you, Jeff. Thanks everybody for watching.
Yep. Thanks everybody. We'll talk soon.